Hi, welcome to Moral Lit, Literary Deep Dives and Discussions. Today we have an exciting podcast to give you. It is going to take place in Chapter 3 of my book, The Lattice Scheme, and we'll be discussing topics about curiosity and options. Okay, so today I have my husband joining me again. He was absent in the last episode, but he's back. Today we will be reading in Chapter 3 from The Lattice Scheme. Our topic comes from the very last page, page 57. And for any of my readers, this is when Azure has finished getting promoted to be an agent. And she's met with her mentor, Alma. They've kind of talked about different things, and now she's kind of playing around with the idea of, is this theory that Detective Granger has about Alma being involved with this missing person legit or not? So she had asked Alma. Alma was evasive. Azure's back home, and she says this one line. You'll have to pick it out of the paragraph if you're reading along. But she says, curiosity was a tricky companion, sometimes a burden, often a powerful tool when wielded wisely. Up until now, Detective Granger had presented her with what seemed like two clear choices: stay out of his world or dive deep into the mystery alongside him and his antics. How myopic had her thinking been? There was certainly more options than that. Those are the sentences we're going to be looking at today. Starting with curiosity. Curiosity, the tricky companion, sometimes a burden, and also a powerful tool. Kind of contemplating this as the author to this series, I can say Azure is extremely curious. What I love about her character is she's constantly asking questions. She continues to ask questions throughout the second book as well. And to some readers, that might seem like, does she ever know what's going on? But really, it's just, she's a curious person. She wants to know. She wants to dig deeper. And yes, that is ultimately how Detective Granger drags her into this dilemma. But we're going to be talking about curiosity as, what is a healthy dose of curiosity? When is it good? When is it bad? How do you know where to draw the line? So we'll kind of start along that line of thinking. Something that came to my mind while I was pondering this today was healthy curiosity is metered by care, integrity, and investigation. But poor curiosity is like gullibility, or sometimes seeking for gossip. What are your thoughts, Zach?
Well, I think there is a healthy curiosity in learning. I think it's one thing to want to ask questions to learn more about a person or a subject. I think it's a totally another thing to pry into someone's personal life that has little to, if it really has little substance to either your relationship with that individual or the overall goal of asking the question. You can ask probing questions, and those probing questions can be uncomfortable as well as just completely unnecessary.
That's true. Curiosity does need to be metered by some, dignity when you're speaking to others. Going on to the negative sides of curiosity first. Let's go on that end of the branch.
Mm-hmm.
When curiosity is not good, yes, it's not good when you're being evasive. And the thing is, how do you know if you're being evasive? Situationally, we should be able to meter that as adults, but sometimes we don't. It is also subject to culture. That's what's coming to my head right now. So I used to live in the Philippines, and common questions in the Philippines are what we would consider as Americans highly evasive. Now, they are naturally curious as to what your age is, as to how many siblings you have, when did you lose your first tooth, where do you live, give me your exact address, like all that stuff we would consider stalkers to be asking is their normal, how I get to know you kind of thing. It's their general curiosity. They feel like you are a friend if they know this information about you, and they don't use it malignantly like people here in America might. Whereas here in America, if I were to express that curiosity, which I swear we all have it as Americans, we all want to know, how old are you? Where are you from? Why did you choose your job? All those things. We have these questions in us, but heaven forbid we ask them. Because the moment you ask them in America, unless you have some sort of understanding with that person already, it's going to come off really bizarre. And good luck having a friendship at all with that person. They're going to think you're a stalker. They might call the police or just downright avoid you. So curiosity is subject to culture. It's subject to context. It's okay to be curious about personal details when you are in an informal situation. It is not okay to be curious about personal details when you're in a professional situation. And that's where awkwardness comes in, because topics like religion, topics like politics, sensitive topics, we might be curious to bring that up in a professional setting because it may, in some regards, affect the work. So, for example, in a couple chapters, Azure, Detective Granger, and Elma, they go undercover. And so some personal questions are asked, like, what is Azure's ring size? What is Detective Granger's first name? Where did Detective Granger and Azure both grow up? Random facts about them. Little personal things are asked. Why? Because it is necessary to their job at that point in order to keep a good undercover role. In our lives, we might have situations like that if we do work undercover, or if it is essential to your role. Like, I once worked in a nonprofit where we did have to discuss politics and political views because we were working with two different political education systems. Sometimes questions like those taboo topics or personal questions are necessary for the work. Now, regardless of whether it's appropriate or not, anytime that we're curious enough to ask personal information or even give it to someone, essentially we're putting a part of ourselves into someone else's hands. And that can be dangerous because you don't know what people are going to do with that. Like, so easily online, we just kind of dish out facts about ourselves to get more followers or whatever without really being curious as to what those people are going to do about it. But, you know, in an everyday setting, the problem with this is that it can lead to something called gossip.
Just in your example, if we're talking about gossip, if you want to avoid gossip, when you obtain information about an individual, whether or not it's true, doesn't matter quite as much, because if you're looking to do something out of love, appreciation, or care, concern, then it's not so much as gospel, but it's private information. And if you spread that information, then it's gossip. If you take that information and then you try to apply it in a way to where you can be more helpful and careful with that individual, then it is more along the lines of just concern and love, and then it becomes private information. And I think too many people want private information to gossip with rather than wanting private information to better understand someone's situation so that they can help them.
Exactly. On a kind of criminology basis, because my book is, of course, mystery, just going along these lines, we know that those who are generally the perpetrators of said crimes that use curiosity for the wrong reason, like they want to know people's personal information to blackmail, to exploit, things like that. But then we have the flip side here where we have the good guys, lawyers, legal agents, FBI, all that. There's no FBI in my series, but in my case, the Bureau. All these folks are trying to get pretty much the same information, but they're not doing it to exploit you. They're not doing it for gossip like others might. They're not doing it to get some sort of dig. The reason they're trying to get the information is to help you. The problem is, as a society, as an American society specifically, we are hot-wired to be suspicious of everybody and anybody when they start asking personal questions, when they start asking us to dig for personal information or to, look into others' backgrounds. And even in a law setting, that can be uncomfortable. In Azure's case, like, this is her mentor, Alma Morales, who, she kind of trusts because she can do this dream ability thing that Azure can now do. She's open, she's friendly, she's always been, like, from the front of meeting her, she's been transparent in Azure's eyes, whereas Detective Granger, like, he just popped out of nowhere, like, what? But she's curious enough to test his theory and enter into this uncomfortable situation of being curious enough to ask her mentor these questions and realize that her mentor is, in fact, being evasive. What is curiosity okay right there? Because, yes, as a legal agent, she is trying to do something to help. Is she going about it the ethical way? We don't know yet. But it seems murky. It seems really murky, and it seems uncomfortable. So I don't know. Just looking at my character analysis, just the way that I wrote that, I'm kind of wondering now, with taking the rest of the series aside, just kind of looking at it in that moment instead of what I know as an author, if I were a reader right there, I'd be like, wait a minute, is Azure gullible? Like, is she being played right now into some sort of something? Like, is it possible that Alma isn't being evasive at all, that she's just uncomfortable because Azure's asking these personal questions? Is Azure not gullible? Is she actually sincerely concerned in her role as an agent as to whether this is a justice or injustice? Now, we do know that Azure has a very strong sense of justice and integrity to the Bureau, so there's that. But I, as an author, I didn't give the readers a ton of information on her. So is it possible she's gullible? Maybe. Curiosity is how I hope my readers will examine all of my characters. Why are they doing what they're doing? Why are they not doing what they should be doing? I hope every reader does that to other books too. Just to go on a little tangent, I do that when I read the books of others. Not to name names. I'm not going to name names. I almost did. But I was reading, I read a lot of mystery usually. Occasionally I entertain audiobooks from another genre because the people that wrote them are people that I support, even though I don't like the genre. And I'll be listening to the audiobook just out of curiosity because I'm curious, how do they write? What drives them as an author? What are their characters like? Because they're more successful than I am. They have more experience. It's got to be good, right? And I'll be listening out of curiosity, my innocent, caring curiosity, and all of a sudden the person will say something or do something in that audiobook, and I will find myself, you readers do this, but like yelling at that character, like, what are you doing, you idiot? Go the other way, or why would you do that, or that's not even ethical. But curiosity, it brings us into these positions where we end up judging others, either for the good or for the bad. And curiosity as a good thing helps us to get to those points where we get to have that experience that brings us to judgment, not looking at judgment as a bad thing, but we as humans, we do need to expose ourselves to more. We need to be curious enough to allow ourselves an experience that will help us to grow in judgment, help us to grow into perspective. And without curiosity, we can't really do that, is what I'm getting at. So the ultimate good side of curiosity is that it pushes us, it drives us to act, it drives us to seek, it drives us to ask questions. The bad side of curiosity is when we take the questioning too far. As topically, I'll give you a scenario or a circumstance you probably relate to. Okay. So both of us are Christian. We grew up in the same church. And a huge part of this church, I don't know about other Christian denominations, but it's you need to ask questions. Like, we are driven to ask a lot of questions. Find answers for yourself is the big take on it. Don't just take my word for it. Don't just take the scripture's word for it. Like, you need to ask God. You need to seek out of resources and find answers. Asking questions is pretty much what is being articulated to mean be curious. Have some curiosity about life. Taken to an extreme, that curiosity will have you questioning every foundation that you ever knew. We see this in politics, right? You might have a position or you might know some things to be true and you start asking questions, and it's good to ask questions in politics, very much. And you start digging and you start researching. But the thing about living in this world is if you keep asking questions and you keep questioning the answers that you get, like you keep that curiosity rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling, you never halt it. You never grab onto an answer. Like, whatever answer you get, it just turns into another question. You end up with no foundation whatsoever. So you might start off on a certain side. You might end up to the other side. You might end up going back and forth constantly. You might end up making up your own philosophy about life. And honestly, you'll just end up more confused than anything. That's the bad end of curiosity that I'm getting at, is like we see people in our church come up with all sorts of strange doctrine, understanding, sometimes leave the church, sometimes they are too extreme in the church, because of this unrelenting curiosity, this unrestrained curiosity that isn't metered in dignity, it isn't metered with any foundation. If curiosity is used to ask questions, to seek answers, to find it using the proper resources, like within that curiosity, you're asking yourself, is this a good resource to trust? What are the merits of it? Mm-hmm. I'm curious to see if this is good or not. Test it out, find out for yourself. And then you hold on to it or discard it. And like that is your baseline for that. That is productive curiosity.
I would argue that that's the difference between curiosity and skepticism.
Yeah.
Because if you're a complete skeptic of everything, then you'll never be satisfied with any answer. Kind of the same thing with individuals who find themselves engrossed in conspiracy theories. There are plenty of people who are very intelligent that find themselves being so skeptical of everything they've ever been taught, where they come to a point where they are no longer using their intelligence in a proper manner. They're finding themselves descending into complete and utter madness and feeling like they know something that nobody else knows, and yet they still have to question everything they already know because they can't accept pretty much any answer. And the answers they do are basically as ambiguous as a religious belief in many ways, where you can only agree to disagree with them. It's quite intriguing how often there are individuals who take things at face value, and there are things that people will take with so much skepticism that they can't even have a foundational truth to base anything off of. It's a difference between being able to recognize gravity and but then also try to find fault with the theory of gravity, or the law, I guess I should say, of gravity. If you turn a law into a theory and then you break it apart a million different ways and then you try to restructure it and rebuild it, you can basically convince yourself of anything. And I think that's where you're trying to get at with the curiosity, because it's one thing to be curious, but it's another to allow too many questions to become basically the starting point of not knowing anything.
Yeah, very much so. And just along the lines of what you're saying, I'll try to bring this kind of full circle back to the front. Communication, curiosity, skepticism, there's a basic communication there, right? With skepticism, when you're constantly questioning everything, like skeptics are what we could call continual lecturers, for lack of a better term. They don't like to debate. They like to argue. They like to question and argue. Their form of communication isn't actually communication. It's speaking and not receiving. It's speaking and not considering. See, being curious about something enough to look into it, but not being willing to actually receive that thing, receive communication back, whether it's something that you read, something that you heard, something that was written to you, something someone said to you, any of those things. If you're not being receptive of communication, then yes, skepticism, that's kind of where it's at. Real curiosity has an actual intent to learn, has an actual intent to receive. So yes, negative curiosity is skepticism. Positive curiosity, not so much. You want to take something in. There is a middle ground though. There's an apathy in there. I had a friend once, back when I worked at a retail store. Wonderful, wonderful friend. We would have really great, usually religious conversations. Sometimes we would have conversations about the work environment, and it would just be lighthearted and fun. But what I noticed again and again and again about this friend is that when it came to a certain topic that will remain unmentioned, they were more of a skeptic instead of curious. They would express questions to me that sounded curious, like they wanted an answer. And whenever I would respond, it would immediately be refuted, rebutted, tossed down, and the person would go right back to their same perspective, like no change, nothing. And I wasn't trying to change their mind. I was literally just trying to answer their question as honestly as I could. So it was strange to me because the question had seemed curious. It seemed that positive way, and yet it wasn't. But at the same time, this person was genuinely curious enough about that topic that I watched them get books and engage with others on it. And the things the other folks would say and bring to this person, they would seriously ingest it, and then they'd come back with more questions to me just to, go back to the skeptical thing. So I'm calling that kind of a middle ground because it's like a delicate dance in between the two. But ultimately, despite this person's semi-curiosity on one side and skepticism on the other, nothing about them ever changed. I think unproductive curiosity, unproductive skepticism is when there's no change in you whatsoever. In my book series, the brilliant thing about Azure's curiosity is that it does change her. As she goes throughout the series, she grows, she learns, she becomes more empathetic, she becomes more enlightened as to different aspects of things. She grows more as a person. At the same time, there's her parallel character, Isabel, who isn't as curious as she should be. She's apathetic towards finding out resources. She's apathetic towards finding the help that could have probably assisted her out of a really tricky situation. And because of that, she ends up far worse out, even though their situations are parallel in many instances. Curiosity matters is what I'm getting at. It matters to both communicate it, receive it. It matters to have it.
I think there's multiple ways to intake information. There's multiple ways to challenge ideas that I think are healthy and productive. I think it's one thing to learn and to ask questions and to try to come to a mutual understanding. I think that's where people usually get things wrong, is there's a difference between trying to come to a mutual understanding rather than convincing. There's plenty of people who ask questions for the sake of probing, ask questions for the sake of diminishing someone else's beliefs or understanding of things. But if you truly are trying to understand and learn, letting the other person talk is the most important thing. When you ask a question and you're trying to get a genuine answer out of them, the last thing you really need to be doing is immediately breaking that apart with more skepticism or more questions. But because there's a natural progression to a productive conversation, and there's a natural devolving to a not so productive conversation, and people can get a sense for that. And I also think that it's unfortunately a lot more common than uncommon for people to enter into a conversation with the idea that they're going to break someone else down instead of build them up by being a listener. In order to be a good teacher or educator, you also have to be able to listen properly and to understand what people are even asking. I think misinterpreting what people are asking with their questions is also a bit of an issue, because a lot of people, without even realizing it, they'll ask one question, but what they're really saying behind it is quite a bit different than what they originally were going for. Because sometimes people will ask very intense questions in order to try and debunk someone, but in reality what they're trying to express is their feelings through that question. They're trying to give you a hint as to what their actual problem is, and sometimes individuals will give it away without realizing it and not truly knowing that they're actually hurting inside, or that they have a different type of problem than what is asked to be solved.
Yeah, articulation. That is a huge, huge thing. How many of us, when we are speaking, are curious enough to ask ourselves, am I articulating what I mean to say? Or when we're listening to others, what is it that they mean to articulate? Is it what they're saying? Or is it something else? Am I curious enough to, reiterate to them what they just said to me to see if it's really what they meant to say? Man, I think communication right there. We could resolve a lot of issues or a lot of assumptions if we were curious enough to actually inquire of one another if what was said was what was meant to be articulated. Because we, as Americans, just to put bluntly, I think all countries struggle with this, but we are not an articulate people. We say things all the time that are trends to say. We use common sayings that are indicated to mean certain things, but if we actually stop and listen to those phrases, a lot of times it doesn't actually accurately articulate what we mean to say. I've heard so many people in the Christian faith articulate things that are thought to be faithful expressions, but really, if you break it apart, are actually kind of testimonies of doubt and shame even. And it's just curious to me how we have this mutual understanding that this phrase is supposed to be something good, but what's articulated isn't actually that. It's a thing. So are we curious enough to question if what we're saying is what we mean to say, if what they're saying is what they meant to say? How many arguments could end if we actually stopped, asked that, and allowed the person a minute to re-articulate what they meant to say? Curiosity about yourself is pretty important. There's a lot of folks that they call it identity searching or whatever. I call it personal analysis. I think we should be curious enough to personally analyze ourselves, get to know ourselves, get to know our weaknesses, get to know our strengths, get to know our desires. Like, you should be curious enough about yourself to do some deep digging, and then be curious at that same level about other people around you. We are surrounded by people of substance. They have fears, they have joys, they have excitement, they have goals in their lives. And what is their why? Do you know what their why is? Why are they driving for that thing? Or do you just have an assumption? That's kind of what Azure's trying to dig at as an investigator in the Lattice Scheme and in the following subsequent books is, what is this person's motive? What is this person's why? We have to be curious to find these things, because if we assume, I want to say almost 80% of the time, we're going to be off somewhere. You can't really assume you know somebody just because actions speak louder than words or whatever. Yes, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. We need to be curious enough to judge those actions. Something else that came to mind about curiosity was actually something that Zach found in a book this week, which gave me a curious other perspective. So I'm just going to kind of reiterate what it was that he sent me and why that kind of goes along this curiosity discussion. So it was a book essentially where this person had gone on vacation and he was checking his email or something, and these two other folks nearby, they saw him checking the email and they made some comment about, wow, even on vacation you work. And so then he wrote something in the book about it being more sad that you spend 50 weeks of the year doing something that you want to get away from for 2 weeks, those 2 weeks of vacation, instead of doing something you love for 50 weeks of the year and not wanting to part from it for 2 weeks of vacation. And I thought, dang, what a curious thought. I had never thought of that before. Am I curious enough to ask myself, hey, is what I'm doing fulfilling a joyful life? Is there a better way? Is there another way? You know, how many of us go into these, not just jobs, but any situation in life, living situations, social groups, agendas, etc. How many of us reside in these perpetual repetitive things and never bother asking ourselves, what am I not seeing that there is to see? What option am I not considering to my life that could be considered? What if there was more? What if there's another way?
Yeah, and just for context, that's from a Seth Godin, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, Seth Godin book called Tribes. I've become a little bit of a super fan of Seth Godin. I've been reading a lot of his books. He does a lot of stuff with marketing and idea, thought provocation. Essentially, is he markets most of his books around marketing, and yeah, one of the things he was talking about there was that, you know, people, they'll spend 2 weeks out of the 50 of their year, you know, just resenting their vacation time. They're not really doing what they think, what they want to or should be doing. I mean, the whole idea behind the book is to become a leader and to find leadership qualities and to create a movement of your own and how to create a tribe. You know, so somebody who's not just devoted to you, but devoted to the idea and backing behind you in a much more meaningful sense. One of the things that I found very profound about that was that most of us are getting by rather than learning how to overcome our problems. When we overcome our wants and our desires, and we find a much more natural way to live our lives. There are many people who will find themselves in a situation where they're working a job or multiple jobs that they don't like because they depend on the financial stability that brings. And I'm not saying that people need to quit their jobs, but I think people have more opportunities than they realize. And most people don't go out and explore new opportunities. And that's one of the things that he's trying to get at, is when we're going out and we're learning and we're exploring and we're trying to expand our possibilities in our lives, we often only look in 2 or 3 places rather than the hundreds of potential places we could go, places we could move, places we could live, places we could work, experiences we could have. It's all a lot more open to us than we typically think, mostly because we're worried about 1 or 2 very insignificant problems that at the end of the day will never not be problems. Mm-hmm. So just go out and do the thing, because you're not really going to find yourself in that much of a worse situation, because if the situation you're in is so horrible already, it can't really get that much worse. Exactly,
yeah. So when we're little, we have this built-in thing in us where we like to ask why. We like to ask what if. We have imaginations as kids. What if there were unicorns? What if there were dragons? What if I could walk on that rainbow? What happens if I try this? What happens if I push this button? Curiosity is an inherent trait of a child. But when we grow up, we get introduced to this lovely thing called fear. And that's the enemy of curiosity. That's the enemy of good curiosity. And I'd say that's what cankers curiosity and skepticism is fear. We're too afraid to ask ourselves, to challenge what we know to be real and to be valid. We don't ask ourselves, is it possible that there's more resources in this town, in this place for me than I knew or realized? Because I'm too afraid that there's not. I'm too afraid of being wrong, because I've been told by the group that I'm surrounded by my parents, by my neighbors, that there's just not. That this is it, that this is a dead-end town, this is a dead-end situation, this is the best that there is for me. All life is for me to work, to try to survive. I'm afraid to find out if they're all wrong, because if they're all wrong, who do I trust? Fear will just kind of warp a question like that into several questions. It'll try to shake your foundation. But curiosity doesn't do that. Curiosity, if we were willing to lay aside fear and have a healthy dose of curiosity, it would ask, hey, is there another perspective I hadn't considered? Is there another way I hadn't considered? Are there resources? Am I willing to, try a couple things and see if there are? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everybody's right and this is the way things are here. But what if, even if that is the way things are here, what if there's another option? And that's that latter part of the paragraph. Azure thought there was 2 options, go on board with Detective Granger and scrutinize her mentor, or just, say no. There's another option. And she goes into it in the following chapter. But, curiosity demands as a powerful tool that you see that there is another option you hadn't seen before. It's discovering the other many options that you hadn't considered before, because we're so stuck in this myopic thinking that fear has diluted our brains down to that the reality that we see now is the way that it is. Unless something ground shaking happens, unless there's a policy change, unless, a friend informs you that there's something new or someone innovates something that you need, this is the way it is. And that's just not true. It's not true. Like, what if you are the one that innovates the change? What about that? What if this very long process of trying to be that change, even though it keeps bringing you to failure after failure, what if it eventually works out? You get your big break and something amazing happens. Isn't it worth, being curious enough to press on, to push on, to try something different, to find those other options to move forward instead of giving into the fear? this control that we think we have when we're afraid to be curious about anything different. There's always other options. So kind of like that perspective. We don't have to be working a job 50 weeks and loathe it. We could be doing something 50 weeks and love it and not want to be apart from it. That might be an extreme example, but you know, more realistically, we'll probably find something that is a nice medium balance of, ups and downs, and it works and it suits us.
Mm-hmm.
And curiosity demands, like, what if that is a satisfying life? I don't know. Why don't we test it? Are we curious enough to test it, to find the truth? And then back to the healthy amount of curiosity instead of the endless one, to establish that foundation, to hold on to that boundary.
It can be pretty easy to rely on what everyone else has taught you and what everyone else has told you, what is best for you. And it's always good to look at all of your options and to take a few more risks than what I think people are comfortable with. I'm much more of a risk taker than I think some of my other family members are, which is fine, but I'd rather move across the country for a new job over sticking with a job that just makes me feel like I can't get anywhere. If something's starting to feel like a dead end, I'd rather try to evaluate my situation and move forward from the dead end rather than stick with it over and over again.
Curious enough to try something different. Like, what actually makes us happy? Growing, progressing, finding a good change. The happiest people in the world are constantly progressing and improving themselves. They're doing things for other people. Like, they are making the what if in other people's lives happen. Those are the happiest people in the world. The ones that are the most miserable are those who are stagnant in especially these certain ideals that, the only way to be happy is to move up the ladder in life, specifically that ladder or that ladder. To reside a certain way. And that's just not true. Life is not, stagnant. Things are always changing and we are always changing. Just in saying that, I feel like there's probably red flags going off in some listeners' heads. Like, are you telling me to challenge my religion? Are you telling me to challenge my lifestyle? Are you trying to, uproot my everything? And yes, no. I'm not telling you to challenge what you know to be true. I'm not telling you to challenge gravity unless you're trying to make like a new aircraft. Like, in that case, yeah, go ahead. But what I am saying is that we need to ask questions about the things that we have fears of. If you have a fear that what you believe to be true isn't, I think it is healthy to question that. I mean, in my faith journey, what I've found is that the more questions I have and I pursue to find answers for, I don't always find answers for, but I always find peace. And it's always strengthened my faith. So yeah, I do think it's good to question things, your foundations from time to time, because that helps you to search and to dive deeper into those foundations, and it strengthens them. If you're not curious about your foundations continually and they're not strengthening, things are going to come and shake them up sooner or later. And I think you would rather that growth comes from you seeking it out on your own than it being compelled on you. That's just my take of it, of fear versus curiosity. But for anybody with red flags going off, be curious enough to consider if what I'm saying is more of an invitation instead of a threat. If you feel the red flags, there's probably a fear in you that should be addressed for your personal peace. I'm not being a radical here. I'm just... God has made us to progress and grow and ask questions. And I think that's a beautiful part of life is let's get to know each other. Let's get to know ourselves. Let's get to know just how incredibly things in this life can work out for us if we're willing to discover them, to use them for a better purpose, and to help others to do the same.
Yeah, to go off of your ladder analogy, there's one quote that I really like where there's a certain individual, I can't remember his name, but he was talking about how if we align ourselves with our purpose and our goals, then that is our ladder that we can use to climb up the side of a building, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, if we're climbing up the wrong building, doesn't matter how far up we get, we're not going to get to the destination that we want. You know, if we have our goals and ideas aligned with each other, and we have the proper amount of risk-taking and curiosity and just continuation of exploration that this life has to offer, then it's a lot easier to go forward with confidence, to know that our ladder is on the right building. But if we just kind of go with whatever everyone else tells us to go and do, that ladder can easily be on the wrong building. And when we get to the top, we'll look around and realize that the sign does not say, you know, your goal. It says everyone else's. It says everyone else's goal. You reached to the top. Congratulations.
And at that point, are you satisfied? Probably not. And if what drove you up that ladder was fear, which it probably was, instead of curiosity, how are you going to respond? How are you going to move on? Because, you know, your life is still going, even if you get there. You don't just suddenly poof, like it's over, end of the game. Life goes on, and you're either going to be stuck there in fear, or maybe, just maybe, you'll have the curiosity to get off that building and find the better one. But you have to have that curiosity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, failure is what I'm getting at now. Are we curious enough to look at failure a different way? Are you curious enough to try something, to let it fail, to move on from it, to find something better? Or are you so afraid of failure that you won't even try? Something about success is moving from failure to failure with grace.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of us, we say that, and the way that it's articulated, we hear in our heads, because this is how our society thinks. Oh, that means I have to just perfectly, every time I fail, just get up. Oh, this is just a step back, and it's all going to get better, and be positive and hopeful and bright and cheery all the time. And no, that's not it. Getting up gracefully does not necessarily equate gracefully in the way that we envision it, as in perfectly. Sometimes going from failure to failure gracefully is us having a good 3 weeks of pure depression and crying and wrecking our brains because we don't see another way until we do. And then we get up and we go after it.
I think people are expecting gracefully to mean blissfully.
Yeah, blissfully.
which is not true, because when we're going through gracefully, it means with dignity.
Mm-hmm.
When we're going from failure to failure, we're dignified in our manner. We don't go out huffing and puffing, stomping and saying everything life is unfair.
Yeah,
we go from failure to failure, recognizing that didn't work. Sure, I still am allowed to feel the bits of depression or the bits of anxiety and the bits of setback that is. But if I just decide to move forward instead, that's what it means to be graceful. That's what I can do in a dignified manner, rather than blaming everyone else for my problems.
Exactly. Mourning is a real thing, y'all. When we fell, there will be a period of mourning. And I would invite everybody to be curious about those periods of mourning. Why do they happen? Because we need them. We need to feel bad sometimes. We want to feel bad sometimes because horrible things hurt. And hurt isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just like pain in and of itself is not inherently a bad thing, which I will actually discuss in the sequel to the Lattice Scheme in detail. But, are you curious enough to examine the other side of what fear tells you to perceive as wrong, such as failure? What is the other side of failure? Strength. People who do weightlifting, I do weightlifting. We know this. We get this. And we're curious about it. How much weight can I lift today? Can I lift 10 pounds more? Can I lift 5 pounds more? Can I lift 1 pound more? I am curious to see if my strength is growing, because every time that my strength fails, what it does is it tears apart these little muscle fibers in my arm. And then when I'm getting the proper nutrients and rest, they rebuild, they reinforce. And so I can lift heavier. That's failure. I go through failure, muscle failure, to get stronger. So I'm curious every time that I go, hit the weights, hit the gym, am I stronger this time because I failed last time? That's the curiosity that I'm inviting everybody to kind of look at. That's the curiosity that Azure's kind of putting herself through every time she makes a mistake, because she makes a lot of mistakes. She's human. We're all human. We can look at our failures and mistakes with curiosity to see the next better part of us that comes from those failures and mistakes. And we can do that for others too. You know, when someone gets knocked down, wouldn't it be great if we, out of curiosity, helped them to be curious? You know, what's next for you? What options do you see? And they say, I don't know. I don't know what to do. Let's think about that. Let's explore that, shall we? Let's explore it together. Let's be curious together. Man, if we could be supporters of one another with curiosity, every time there was a mistake, every time there was a failure, every time there was mourning or pain, what a difference that would make. I think that would make a profound difference. It would help us to see that there's not just A and B as an option. It would help us to see that there is not just another option. There's many other options we hadn't considered. Suddenly we're empowered as a society because we have that healthy amount of curiosity. And it's not invasive. That's curiosity with care. That's curiosity with compassion, with empathy. That's curiosity with a purpose to grow. And if you have that sort of curiosity that is empathetic, that is caring, you're going to find that you're pretty dignified in how you go about using it, how you go about asking questions and seeking things and finding and discovering and testing instead of being a skeptic. Kind of where we're going to wrap up today with this podcast. It's gone a little over, but just inviting everybody to take a curious look at yourself, take a curious look at life, challenge yourself. If you haven't picked up a copy of my book, The Lattice Scheme, check it out on Amazon or on my website. And as always, subscribe to this podcast.